Hello, and welcome to Senior Code Review Buddy. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about data and how it can be helpful to create structures for it, even when it might seem like too much work. Passing data around a program is a really important part of coding. It's hard to do anything that's too complex without needing to move some data around at some point. Sometimes, when dealing with just a small amount of data, it can feel like the easiest thing to do is just move it around as is, in a list or a small Python tuple or something like that. If it's just a list of paired data, say a username and a currency, maybe you can just pass it around like that and rely on everyone to know that the first element is the username and the second element is the currency. But what happens if someone doesn't realize that and they get the order mixed up, or they think it's username and country? In these cases, they'd probably be able to figure it out quickly, but it would take them some time and slow them down. And if you're passing around pairs that are harder to tell apart, like file creation time, file modification time, I think it's easy to see how the order could get fixed up, not realized, and lead to potential bugs. And what if down the line you actually need to pass a third value around with that pair, say a time zone? If you just follow the current pattern, you just kind of add it onto that tuple, you've now got a tuple of 3 elements getting passed around. And if someone needs to add something else, they maybe just follow the pattern as well. And you do that a couple times, and now you've got a complex tuple of 6 or 7 elements getting passed around, and it's really not helping your readability. I hope this brief description shows some of the downsides of just passing around data like that without using structures. So let's look at a few examples and see how we can improve things in these situations. All right, for example 1, we've got something pretty close to what I described in the introduction. We've got a function, getUsername and emails, that returns a list of tuples, with each tuple representing a username and an email. And then we've got some code down here that just prints out what username has what email. Pretty simple, but I think you can see one problem here. We called the function getUsername and emails, but we actually returned it in the order of email and username. This isn't a problem in this code here, as we correctly wrote that user is in position 1 and email is in position 0, but it feels like this could be a problem down the line. So we could just fix the tuples today by rearranging them, but that feels more like a band-aid solution than a great long-term fix. Instead, let's just create a basic data class and pass that back instead of a tuple. So we'll create something class user object by so user email user email equals email. And then instead of saying we're returning username and emails, we'll just say get users. And we will have users here. Now, I will change the order that we've got these in, because in thinking about the class, I do think it makes sense to have the user come before the email, but depending on the context, maybe you did want to keep the order that we had here before. Let's make changes. Then for this code, change this, and now instead of user position 1, we'll say, I guess that actually should be .name. Fix that. Name. Yeah, so user.name and user.name. So this looks much simpler, easier to read, and I think this is also a good base if we have to build off it in the future and add anything else to this. All right, let's see what example 2 looks like. Okay, for example 2, we're doing some interesting work with regexes. It looks like we are given a log entry line that could contain an ID, a first name, a last name, and a color. If it does contain those, we return them as a tuple. If it doesn't, we return none. Now, we don't know where these log entries are coming from and how likely or possible it is that this format could change. But let's do a brief thought exercise and imagine we needed to add a middle name. How hard would that be? Well, if we assume the middle name goes between the first and last name, updating the regex is pretty easy. You just have something like, for example, and then just middle name, just the same pattern elsewhere. So the regex will work, it will correctly find them. But our return now has changed. Instead of returning a tuple of 4 items, we're returning a tuple of 5 items. And the position of last name and color has changed. So if someone was just using this function and getting color, they have to update the position of it. It's no longer in position 3, it's now in the 4th final position. And they also have to update references to last name. That doesn't seem great. We could change the code here to change the order, and we could still return ID, first name, last name, color, and then return middle at the end. But that doesn't feel great either, because now we sort of split up the different parts of a name. So I don't really like either of these approaches. So instead, let's create a new data structure, log entry, to contain this data. We'll just have something simple. Entry checked. Now, we'll just do this for the case when we don't have the middle name. We won't have that simple. Yes. Rid of that, because that was just for the fun exercise. And now, instead of just returning the raw tuple, return a log free comment. Putting the items in the right order. All right. So with this change, I think it's easier to see that if we had to add a middle name, we just would add it here, would pass the right value to the constructor. It's relatively easy to do. The nice part as well is that we're not going to change how people would access last name or color. They would access them by doing log entry .color .last name. So it's making things much nicer. In fact, in the old approach, when we were just returning the tuple, we actually were leaking sort of how this regex works. People kind of knew that, oh yeah, we found ID first, then first name, then last name, then color. That's an implementation detail, and it probably doesn't matter to the users of this. If color was to actually be the first item, that shouldn't change how anyone outside this function was interacting with us. So not only is it making it easier to pass things around, we're also not leaking an implementation detail that we were kind of leaking before. So I'm happy with this change here. Let's go to our final example. All right, this example is from a podcast program I've been working on for a few years, and it's not quite like the other examples today. This code was in a helper file, helper.py, and it's making calls into an ffmpeg helper file I have to convert a file. Initially, I started looking at this because stream is getting passed around, and I was wondering if there should be a better structure for it. But stream actually isn't getting passed with any other variables. It's self-contained, so it's actually not a good candidate for fixing in the way we've changed the other programs today. But in looking at this, I then noticed where all the work in this function is actually being done. All of the functions we're calling are in ffmpeg helper.ffmpeg. We're not actually doing anything in helper itself. We're just routing everything sort of 2 levels deep. We're kind of going into the implementation details of ffmpeg helper. That's not probably the right thing to do. So this file isn't probably the right file for this helper. Instead, this should probably live in ffmpeg helper. If we were to make that move, all that we would do is change those references. The code is actually a little easier now because there's one less level of indirection in everything. So this is actually probably in the right spot now. So this is just a little fix that jumped out at me when I was looking at some structured data issues, and I think it really improves the readability of the code and hides some implementation details better. Thanks for walking through these examples with me today. I hope that in the future, if you find yourself tempted to pass around just sort of some raw data, you pause for a moment and ask if the code would benefit from having a data structure there. If you have any comments, code you'd like me to review, or ideas you'd like me to talk about, please leave a comment below or reach me at chris@seniorcodereviewbuddy.com. Thanks, and have a great day.